Hi folks, this is Tierah Ruins Things with Science, a podcast about the science of immunology and diseases in pop culture. I am Tierah, and I am here to ruin your favorite TV shows and movies by telling you how badly they butchered science. Today, for my first episode, I have to go with a TV show that had a big impact on me as a kid and is still one of my favorites. And I would argue it's one of the best TV shows ever made. I am, of course, talking about Star Trek: The Next Generation. This episode that I'm going to be talking about today is from Season 1, Episode 2, called The Naked Now. And since this is a direct homage to one of the original series episodes called The Naked Time, I'll be covering that also. These are episodes where the crews of the two Enterprises become infected with something that causes them all to act like they're drunk and which can be spread by touch. All the old Star Treks are currently streaming on Netflix, at least in Canada. If that's no good for you, I think they're on Amazon Prime, and Crave has the newer series. I think they'll all be moving to Paramount Plus eventually, if they're not already there, depending on your market. If you're old enough like me, you might even have them on DVD or VHS. So with all that being said, buckle in and let's go ruin some shit with science. In the original series episode, the Enterprise is orbiting a planet that is about to disintegrate, and they're there to rescue a science crew from the surface. They find instead that the whole science team is dead and everything is frozen and covered in frost. So Spock and this red shirt lieutenant named Tormelin beam down to the surface to find out what happened. They're wearing what look like these red biohazard suits, and the first thing I thought was that the hoods aren't connected to the body, so they're going to be doing absolutely nothing. But, then this becomes a plot point a minute later. This whole scene could actually be a safety video on what not to do that you show to new undergrads on their first day in the lab. Tormelin takes off his glove to itch his nose up through the disconnected hood, and then, without putting his glove back on, braces himself against the wall and looks under a table. This red substance that looks like blood oozes out of the frost that's covering the wall, and it gets on his hand. Then, startled, he stands up, lifts his hood, and shoves his hand right up in there and gives his hand a big ol' sniff, as you do on an alien planet when a strange thing just touched your hand. Biosafety suits like this do exist for when you're working with a very dangerous pathogen like tuberculosis or Ebola, but the hoods are connected and they have their own air supply so you don't get sick. If you have to itch your face, you either have to leave the area to a clean room and take your hood and gloves off, or you find a way to itch your nose on the inside of your hood by rubbing it against your shoulder or something. Having worked with many things in my life that you don't want to get in your eyes, or even just, trying to maintain sterile hands, I'm a master at itching anywhere on my face with my shoulder or upper arm. Second of all, if you get something funky on your hand, don't smell it. That's bad lab habits. We are very cautious when we're sniffing things. You don't just shove something towards your nose and take a big whiff. Not unless you want to pass out or become unalive. You waft smells towards you by slowly pushing the air above it towards your face. But, like I said, this is a plot point here. Maybe you're thinking that back then they didn't know as much about infectious diseases in order to portray them properly. However, this original episode was released in 1966. So back then, smallpox was still a thing. The last naturally occurring case of that was in 1977. And the world definitely knew about respiratory transmitted diseases in 1966. But also, maybe just realistic science was apparently not a priority with this show, which is fine. Suspension of disbelief is definitely a thing as a scientist watching movies about science, as with, a lot of other specialized occupations or hobbies when you see your occupation portrayed in a movie. I just figure they could have had Tormelin, rip his suit on something, maybe not realize it, and then get infected that way. That would have been better. Anyways, so Spock and Tormelin get beamed back up and then held in the transporter for decontamination. Obviously, this doesn't work, and as people come into contact with Tormelin, this, whatever it is, pathogen, it spreads exponentially through the ship. People start having anxiety, they're sweating, but they don't have a fever. There are emotional outbursts and episodes of insubordination. Sulu gets inspired to, get shirtless, take his clothes off, and start trying to make people fence with him in the corridors. So that's an interesting one. While discussing the outbreak, Spock says,
"Instruments register only those things they're designed to register. Space still contains infinite unknowns."
And this is important to remember in earthly science too. We can only detect what we know to look for. Eventually, they discover that the problem is caused by a new type of water polymer, which, that's not a thing, as neither oxygen nor the hydrogen in water is capable of forming long chains that are necessary for something to be called a polymer. I believe the longest chain you can make of oxygen is 3, which is called ozone. Ozone is important, it's in the atmosphere, but it breaks down really easily, so longer chains just aren't stable. There's a whole homeopathic fad of drinking ozonated water as if it's got health benefits. This is not supported by science. It also doesn't get you drunk, and you can't pass ozone to other people through your sweat, as seen in this episode. It almost sounds like they're trying to describe prions. Those are proteins that we normally have in our bodies that are folded wrong, which then go on to cause bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, among other things. The problem is, water doesn't fold. It certainly can't fold wrong, and it can't form long chains of molecules. Eventually, Bones develops a serum of some kind that acts as a cure, and everything goes back to normal. Except there's some weird gravity time travel-y thing at the end of the episode. I don't know enough about physics to attempt to shit on that part, so I'm just going to leave that. But keep in mind what I just said about water polymers, though. There's an interesting little tidbit of historical science panic coming up. First, let's compare all of that to what happens in the Next Generation episode. We begin with a similar premise. So the Enterprise crew is meeting up with a science team, this time on a ship rather than a planet. They hear the sounds of a party over the comm channel, and someone propositions the men on board the Enterprise, and then there's an explosive decompression followed by a lack of life signs. To investigate, Commander Riker takes Geordi LaForge, Data, and Tasha Yar over to the other ship. Right away, we have a much better reason for the Enterprise crew member contracting the space virus. Geordi is the unlucky one this time. He's exploring a cabin, which just happens to be frozen like the science station from the original series. So he enters the cabin, he finds it covered in frost, and then a surprise door opens and a frozen lady falls out and he catches her. And then that's where he gets infected, which you can tell due to the handy little swooshing sound effect. Wouldn't it be great if there was a little swooshing sound every time you were about to get sick by being infected by something? I think that would be cool. Meanwhile, Dr. Crusher starts trying to find a reason for what's happening on the science ship, and Picard orders a full transporter screening and medical exams upon return. However, again, it doesn't work. Geordi and the rest of the team, they return, but this time, Geordi scans as normal, except he's sweating and irritable, just like Tourmaline was in the original episode. He wanders out of sickbay and transmits the infection to Tasha, which starts the whole shipwide epidemic. Riker and Data begin searching for information on someone showering in their clothing after hearing Geordi's report. And then in the computer logs, they find that the first Enterprise said that the disease was caused by complex water molecules that acquired carbon from the body and acted like alcohol. So just like water forming a polymer, this is not a thing. Water cannot acquire carbon from your body and turn it into alcohol. That's not how alcohols are made. Ethanol is the alcohol that we drink, but it's generally formed by the fermentation of sugars. Yeasts use enzymes to do this, and they break apart the sugar molecule into pieces and reform it as an alcohol. So water is not the starting material, sugar is. Meanwhile, the epidemic is spreading, and the symptoms here are very similar to the original Enterprise. So there's wild partying, excessive horniness, including Mr. Data, who presumably loses his virginity.
I am programmed in multiple techniques.
There's also the feelings of being too hot and the lack of self-preservation instincts. The one thing that confuses me, though, is that Data does get infected. I don't know if he uses water really a lot. He might do, but alcohol certainly shouldn't have an effect of making him drunk. And I know it's some sort of plot point. I know maybe the writers were trying to stay away from having Data be an exact counterpart to Spock from the original series by showing he could be affected. I don't know. What I do know is that Dr. Crusher has a little bit more trouble finding a cure this time, as the original one listed in the database doesn't work, even though it's not really described at all.
Number one, it seems our security chief has the equivalent of a snootful.
Alright, so as far as I found in researching this, there are no Earth viruses or toxins that directly cause these and only these symptoms. And as I've explained, you can't make a water polymer. Back in the 60s, though, the scientific community didn't know this. There was a short-lived panic that began in 1966, and it was called the Polywater Gap. See, in 1962, a Soviet scientist named Nikolai Fizyaikin published a paper talking about something called offspring water, which could be formed by condensing distilled water in very thin glass capillaries. Supposedly, this water was 40% denser than regular water, it reflected light differently, was viscous, and it didn't evaporate like regular water did. This new form of water was announced to the world in 1966 at the Faraday Society in England, and it took over the scientific community. People were theorizing it could be a new industrial lubricant, maybe an antifreeze or an anti-corrosive agent. And it was so easily made from cheap materials that it got people really excited. Other scientists replicated this according to instructions published in the magazine Popular Science. They put out a 3-page spread on how to do it at home. In 1969, the Office of Naval Research in the US held a symposium on offspring water to talk about how they could make some and not be left behind by the Soviets. After this symposium, 2 scientists named Ellis Lippincott and Robert Stromberg agreed to research it together. At the time, studying it involved measuring its density, shining all kinds of light and lasers at it, and then seeing what happened and what wavelengths were reflected. Nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR, and X-ray crystallography were invented prior to this, and they're ways that chemists can figure out the structure of molecules. So I'm not sure why they didn't try these techniques. Maybe it was too expensive for them at the time. I don't know. Anyways, they published an article in the journal Science later the same year in which they theorized that the water molecules were forming a honeycomb structure, which made them denser than regular water. In this article, they named the substance polymeric water, or polywater. Notably, the journal Science is pretty much the most prestigious journal out there, so this was a really big deal. In the same year, a man named F.J. Donahoe wrote a letter to Nature, another prestigious journal that it's hard to publish in, explaining that if polywater could spread and turn other water into polywater just by touching it, then it was going to be the most dangerous substance on the planet and that we were all doomed. Over 100 papers were published in 1970 about polywater. But in 1971, a scientist named Denis Rousseau also published an article. He had found that polywater contained calcium, potassium, chlorine, and critically, a substance called sodium lactate, collectively otherwise known as all the chemicals found in human sweat. It was found that during the preparation of polywater, while handling these tiny glass capillaries used to, quote, condense it, the scientists had been sweating on their equipment, and that when they were trying to evaporate the regular water, they were instead condensing their own sweat, and the sodium lactate made it thicker. So the polywater phenomenon was quickly abandoned and shoved under a rug somewhere, but that was in 1971. Just a, little side note here, this is kind of exactly how science is supposed to work. You find out something new, you test it, come up with theories to explain it, and then when reliable evidence doesn't support that theory, or it supports another theory, you accept that, you change your stance, and you move on. You abandon the stuff that isn't explaining things right. This first Star Trek episode was made, like I said, in 1966, right when the polywater frenzy was just getting started. Nobody at the time knew what polywater could or couldn't do, and it made for a fetchingly futuristic issue that connected with current news and discoveries. So maybe it wasn't polymeric water, but there is a thing that could have caused the symptoms that the crews were facing. A virus would make a likely candidate, and there are a lot of gastrointestinal viruses out there that can cause wooziness or nausea, though they don't tend to cause excessive happiness, horniness, or partying, as far as I know. If you've got a GI virus, you're probably shitting and vomiting everywhere, so you probably wouldn't want to leave your bathroom, let alone go out partying. So my guess is it's probably not a virus. That's not what I think it is. I do quickly want to shout out a couple other infectious pathogens that do cause intoxication.
Counselor, it's not actually an infection.
Yes, sir. It's more like an intoxication. But whatever it is, she's got it.
Now, I'm being a bit cheeky here because intoxication has a slightly different meaning when talking about infectious diseases. Intoxication means you have a large amount of a toxin in your body. And everywhere else that isn't this podcast, intoxication usually means alcohol. But really, it could mean anything caused by a toxin. There are a lot of bacteria that secrete toxins that are actually what cause the symptoms of the disease that we get. So technically, they're intoxications also. You've probably heard of them. We've got botulism, caused by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, and tetanus, caused by Clostridium tetani. Diphtheria and cholera are also caused by bacterial toxins. And the last one I'll mention is dysentery, which is caused by Shigella dysenteriae that secretes Shiga toxin. Now, the gene for Shiga toxin has been picked up by some strains of E. coli, and those are creatively called Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. And you might hear about those in the news sometimes if there's an outbreak, and it's usually lettuce or salad that gets recalled. All of these cause a lot of diarrhea, vomiting, and generally feeling like shit. But again, not quite what we're seeing on the Enterprises. For that, the closest syndrome that I've got that could cause what the crews saw is something called autobrewery syndrome. That's exactly what it sounds like. Auto means you're doing it to yourself, and brewery means you've got a tiny little brewery inside you that's producing alcohol. So alcohol is a waste product made by some bacteria species, or yeasts. Like I mentioned earlier, yeast takes sugars and ferment it into ethanol. So one of those yeasts is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's also known as brewer's yeast, and it can do that in humans and other animals. We've got a long history of taking advantage of this. There are some Candida species of yeast that can do it too. These are microbes that you have in your body naturally. Most people have some alcohol-producing bacteria in their guts, but won't have any brewery symptoms because they don't make up a large proportion of what's there. Same with Saccharomyces and Candida. These are very common yeasts. They're present in our food and environment, so we do see them a lot in the digestive tract. The problem happens when you end up with way too much of these species, so the total amount of alcohol that they're producing is enough that you can start to feel it. Sometimes it's just a light buzz, maybe some dizziness or brain fog. But then there have been people who've developed a blood alcohol level of 0.4. Not 0.04, 0.4. That's almost a lethal amount. So for my master's, I studied the use of fecal transplant to alter the gut microbiota. You probably know that we have all got bacteria in our guts, but you might be tempted to think of the microbiota as a static thing inside you that never changes or does anything important. That is wrong. Inside our bodies is a flourishing microscopic ecosystem that's just as intricate and complex as those forest food web things that we all learned about in grade 5 science class. We have hundreds of species inside us, and for the most part, the good or beneficial ones take up all the space and eat all the food, so the bad or harmful ones can't grow to high numbers. This is what's called competitive exclusion. Harmful species like E. coli and Clostridioides difficile, otherwise known as C. diff, can't replicate if there's no food or space for them. It's a fragile balance, though, and if you get sick, say you catch a virus or a toxin that gives you really bad diarrhea and all the good species get rinsed out, or maybe you need to take antibiotics for a long period of time, all of this, it wreaks havoc on your microbiota. Unfortunately, the harmful species tend to be hardier and more resistant to antibiotics than the good ones, so they stick around and expand when all the good guys are dead. Sort of how, dandelions can grow on concrete, but your carefully tended houseplant is allergic to tap water. So there was this guy who developed autobrewery syndrome after a round of antibiotics that he'd been on after an injury. The antibiotics would have wiped out most of the bacteria, which left space for the alcohol-producing yeast to grow to high numbers, because yeasts are not susceptible to antibiotics. His case is quite interesting, but a little tragic too. He was initially arrested for driving while intoxicated and was taken to the hospital where he was found to have a blood alcohol level of 0.2. The hospital staff and police, of course, did not believe him when he said he hadn't been drinking. This man's aunt, though, she was a total badass and she believed him, and she pushed for him to go see a doctor who had recently treated a similar case that she had seen about in the media. After testing, they found brewer's yeast present in his stool, and they did a test where they fed him a high-carb meal. They constantly monitored his blood alcohol level, and they saw it rise to 0.06, just after eating carbohydrates. So another side note here, a carbohydrate is basically just a long polymer of sugar molecules. So if you're eating carbs, you're actually eating sugar. So they treated this man with antifungals and prescribed him a low-carb diet, and then they discharged him. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end, because the fungi grew back and he was experiencing symptoms again. The next time, his blood alcohol levels were so high, he fell and hit his head and was admitted to another hospital, where again they monitored his blood alcohol level and saw it range between 0.05 to 0.4. This time, they found Saccharomyces and Candida species in his gut, so they threw a bunch of antifungals at him, and they eventually started him on a probiotic as well to try to add back the good bacteria to fill up the space so the fungi couldn't replicate and take over again. Eventually, after a long treatment, he managed to recover. There's another report of a man who went to the doctor after becoming drunk when he was drinking just fruit juice. He was found to have a blood alcohol level of 0.4 also, but this time the culprit was a high alcohol producing bacteria. Same situation, they had to give him lots of antibiotics to treat the syndrome. So, for now, my best hypothesis on what happened to the Enterprise is that the crew got infected with a space virus or a toxin that gave them all diarrhea. This affected their microbiotas, and this led to the alcohol-producing yeasts in their body having out-of-control replication, which produced enough alcohol to cause the crew to become intoxicated. The show writers obviously couldn't or didn't want to show the crew having explosive diarrhea on the TV back in the 60s or the 80s, so they made their own sort of polywater substance that was a current hot topic in the media then, just to keep people, thinking of current events. So, how could they cure this? Well, in our bodies, we have an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase that converts alcohol into a simpler molecule that causes the hangover feelings that you get.
I made this a broader-based remedy. I hope.
So I think that when Dr. Crusher discovered this serum or cure, it was probably a highly concentrated version of a faster-acting alcohol dehydrogenase to sober everyone up. They probably also got the computers to add lots of probiotics to the replicator food for a few weeks just to prevent this syndrome from recurring. Alright folks, that's all I have for this first episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. Just a reminder that I am a researcher, I'm not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice, as it is for entertainment only. You can follow me on Twitter at Biology Selfies, on Facebook at Tierah Ruins Things with Science, and on TikTok at Tierah Ruins Things. I'll put all those names in the show notes, as well as a link where you can see all my sources and a transcript. Thanks for listening, and thank you to everyone who helped me bring this episode to life and who supported me on my journey through science to getting to this point. I did all the research, writing, and recording, and the music was written and provided by James Stratton Crawley, and he also helped with the editing and production. And there will be a link to his channels in the show notes also. If you have suggestions for TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover, get in touch on social media or email them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com. See you next time, where we'll be talking about the Marvel movie Venom and parasite infections.